today we're going to be hearing from Sebi. So I'd like you all to give a huge round of applause to Sebi.
Yeah, so tonight we're thinking about what shapes our identity. And I know for you, Sebi, that's something that has changed a lot for you in the last year or so. So can you tell us a little bit about where your identity was when you came to uni?
Yeah, happily. So came to uni in all those years ago, 2017, and lived the typical university lifestyle of much on this topic of lunchtime talk, sex, drinks, and jesters. Kind of spent probably about 2 years looking at that, and came to the conclusion that it wasn't really fulfilling my long-term joy. And it was also safe to say that I didn't have a career in dancing. So yeah, kind of ended up coming out of that and, coming into lockdown, looking at what is the meaning of life and asking all these quite big questions. So yeah, it was probably very much party and drinking.
So very much like what Niv was talking about this morning then?
Very much, yeah.
And so now that's changed for you, hasn't it, in the last year, last 12 months or so. So where does your identity lie now? If that's what you were before, what's it like now?
Pretty much this time last year, became a Christian. So my identity now lies in Christ, in Jesus. But it was kind of, in some sense, 3 main kind of points where my identity actually lies. And as I go back to the point of realization that drinking and partying didn't really fulfill my, I suppose, human need for more. And that just looking at some of the accounts of Jesus and some of the key eyewitness accounts. And as one of them says, it's, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So that was quite kind of encouraging in the fact that I have everything I need, so to say.
And that's Jesus speaking, isn't it? So,
yeah.
And it's not going to rob you of sex, drinks, jesters, whatever it is.
No, I think it just brings some perspective on life, and there's, we're told that we can enjoy all of these things, but in moderation and at certain times in life. So it's, I always had that idea of, a Christian, from maybe a secular point of view and out of my probably poor judge of faith, that, it's boring, but it's really not.
So you mentioned a couple more things. You said there's 3 things. So.
Yeah, so the second one was kind of not fearing the future, so to say. Just putting all your trust in Christ has been very helpful in the last few years. And ever since kind of looking at the Bible, it was kind of one of my most favourite verses, is one which says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" And that really resonated with me because before becoming a Christian, I was very image-focused. I was very kind of, what brands of clothes I'm wearing, how my hair looks. As you can probably tell, that's not really gone off now. And yeah, just putting my image in how I looked and came across to other people. But now it's very much in Christ, and I have the joy of knowing that I don't have to worry about these things.
And third point?
And the third point is suffering. So suffering exists, but I can be reassured that I know that through suffering I can, that God can work it to bring goodness and maturity, and that it produces, in essence, eternal value.
And that sort of touches on what Pete was talking about last night. We'll hear from Pete again later, touches a bit on what Pete talked about last night. So you've been talking about when I read the Bible, this, and when you became a Christian. How did that actually happen? I mean, there might be some people here that are like, okay, we've seen this big realization, like it's changed from what you were 2 years ago when you came to uni and then till last year. So what actually happened? What steps were taken, I suppose, or what happened on your journey that it's gone from that one thing to now your identity in Jesus?
Yeah, so I didn't really grow up in a Christian background or family home of Christians. Came to uni, living that lifestyle. I play a lot of tennis, and I met someone quite influential who played tennis as well, and came to know he was a Christian, and from my point of view, he was just a really nice guy. And he invited me along to church, and I think I was very hungover on the day. Went along, and wasn't really against it, but wasn't really gripping it with both hands. And on the Sunday afternoon, trying to escape and run off, get back to bed, got approached by someone, one of the pastors at the church, and said, "Let's meet for a coffee." And that was about 2.5 years ago. So spent the next 2 years trying to, in some sense, disprove the faith. And in my own head, it was important for me to know if I believed anything, what I believed and why I believed it. And if I didn't believe in anything, understand why I didn't believe in it. So if ever I was asked, I could say. So 2 years of scrutinising this poor man of all the questions that an atheist could ask, came to realise that it stands up to scrutiny. And I said this time last year, I believe.
And it was about a year ago, wasn't it, last February?
It was the 25th of February.
There you go.
So next week.
So that's just a really encouraging little story, Sebi, where he finds his identity now in Jesus, how he's gone from that journey. So maybe that's resonated with you a bit. Maybe that's something you're interested to find a bit more about. Sebi will be around at the end. I'm sure you can ask him a couple of questions. Is that all right?
Happily try and answer questions.
Good. Lois. Let's round of applause for Sebi.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Now I'm going to invite Pete up. He works with Christian unions around the country and is going to continue looking at purpose, which we've been looking at this week.
Listen, one of my favourite movies, it's old, I'm showing my age a bit, it's called The Bourne Identity. Pretty old now, but has anybody here seen it? Oh, well done, discerning people. You might remember that as the movie picks up, a man is found floating unconscious in a raging sea, and a fishing trawler eventually comes and picks him up. It becomes apparent that this guy has been shot several times, and when he comes round, he has no memories whatsoever. He has forgotten everything, and the only clue to who he is a device which has been implanted under his skin. And when it's activated, it projects the 10-digit number of a deposit box in a Swiss bank. Now, in time, the man goes to the bank, opens the deposit box, and inside are numerous passports, driving license, fake IDs, and backstories. And all of a sudden, the man has this whole range of identities before him. Does he want to be an American investment banker, or a German art critic, or an English journalist? All of the options are there. Now, the Bourne Identity and the amazing franchise that grew out of it asks us an important question about personal identity. That's the thing we're considering tonight. First, though, what is personal identity? I've got to say, that in of itself is a question that we could talk about for hours. Here is the definition I want us to work with tonight. Your personal identity is the story that you tell yourself about yourself. Your personal identity is the story you tell yourself about yourself. Now, each of us understands that there are a whole load of different aspects to our story. You might be able to see some of them on the screen. You already have lots of different aspects to your personal identity. As you grow older, more will be added to the list. So there's your age and your biological sex and your body shape and your social status. There's your education experience, what your parents do, your sexuality, your passions, your interests, and it will continue to change as you move through life. Your relationships, your income, your future job will all affect your personal identity. Now, what personal identity does is it takes all of these different details of our life and they say, here are the headlines. Here is who you are. And so as we see it, these headlines sort of explain all of the other details of our lives, and they sort of give them a shape and a color. So what I'm trying to show in this diagram is you could think of your personal identity as the hub that holds together all of the different spokes of our lives. Or if you prefer a different image, your personal identity is kind of the plot line that holds together and guides you through all of the different scenes of life as they change. And today, finding a personal identity is really hard. Now, it was actually a bit easier for most of our ancestors, because most of the categories of life that made sense of their lives were relatively fixed. So if like my ancestors, you were born into a family of farmers or miners, then to be honest, your future career was already pretty much mapped out. In fact, your life was pretty much mapped out. If you were born into a farming family, you would become a farmer. If you were born into a mining family, you'd become a miner. And that was pretty much that. And it meant then that a person's personal identity was fairly static and fairly simple. Most people would have thought that their personal identity was assigned to them as they were born. It was, particularly colored by your family heritage or the part of the world that you happened to be born into or your class. And if there was a unique aspect to personal identity at all, it would mainly be thought of in terms of relationships. So if I'd been born a few generations earlier, if I'd thought about my personal identity, I might have thought of myself as Anne and Stephen's son, or Linda's husband, or Samuel and Toby's dad. And actually, this remains an important part of thinking about personal identity in a lot of the countries that we come from. To be honest, this way of thinking about personal identity is quite acceptable as far as it goes, but it always runs the risk of a danger, doesn't it? Do you see what the danger is? It always runs the risk of failing to see people as people rather than just nodes within a web of relationships. There's another problem as well, that this sense of identity can place really unfair and stifling expectations upon those who never quite fit, for whatever reason, that they fit the mold. When the headline is that you need to be just like your parents or your grandparents, there are important details that are unique to you which you may never get to show at all. And this is why, at least in the West, as social mobility increased, most of us now don't primarily look to our grandparents or our parents when it comes to figuring out who we really are. And yet it's really hard finding an identity in its place. After all, we're not given a personal identity in the same way anymore. And so we think, well, I need to find a personal identity for myself. I still need the map to live by. I still need a way of making decisions. And in many senses, it's your personal identity which guides you to make wise decisions even as your company changes. We don't want to be the kind of person who happens to be a vegan one day and then a fox hunter the next day just because of who we're around. Your personal identity helps you to think, this is what I stand for. This is who I am. And so the main approach then that in the West we've taken to personal identity, and to some extent, even if you're not from the West, the fact that you're studying in the West will cause you to think of this way in some ways. The way that you find your personal identity is to look inside. Be true to yourself is perhaps the most repeated line currently in movies and songs. That's the way you find your personal identity. And at first that feels really freeing because, after all, who knows you better than you? And in a world in which we're only too aware of the dangers of false labels or false judgments being put on us, it actually feels quite safe as well. Nobody anymore has the right to tell me who I am. No one can take away who I am. I'm safe. And this is why you can meet people with incredible personal identities. You might meet someone who describes themselves as a British Asian, Gothic, Marxist computer analyst. Or you might meet someone who deep down thinks of themselves as a lesbian, self-employed, progressive, neoconservative environmentalist. And we would say, do you know what, that's your right. And actually, says Western culture, that's your responsibility. You must find a suitable identity that matches who you really are, which will help you to make decisions which are true to you and which will lead you towards the hope of being happy. But can you see the problems? Here's the big one. On what or on whom do I base the identity? Which are the headlines upon which I make this understanding of who I am? Even in the example that I just gave, what helps a person to know, for example, whether or not they should think of themselves primarily as a British Asian, or the Marxist bit, or the computer analyst bit, which of those bits is most important to them? Which is the lens through which you see the other bits? In other words, if I'm going to shape my life and my decisions on this basis of who I am, how can I be sure that I'm selecting the right headlines? How can I be sure I'm selecting the right anchor points? If I start by thinking of myself as a British Asian, I might tell one story about myself. It's a quite different story if I start with the Marxist bit, and a different story again if I start with the computer analyst bit. And here's the thing, it all gets much more complicated when we recognize that what our culture said just a couple of decades ago, this is a good anchor point, a good headline, now says, no, that is not a good headline, that is not a good anchor point, and in fact, it's quite repressive. And so here's the question, what if the headline we choose to live by is scorned and shames us later on in our lives? Actually, we're led to just a very fluid sense of personal identity. My identity is only ever temporary. And if anything is only ever temporary, there are people who will exploit us, not least people in marketing. So, have you ever noticed that very few adverts actually give us information about their product that they want to sell us? They actually want to sell us an identity. So you can be as successful as a well-known footballer if you use the right deodorant, or you can check all of the right ethical boxes if you wear the right clothing from the right source. When you stop and think about it, it's actually quite ridiculous buying your identity in this way. The thing is, we quite literally do buy it. I wonder if you think about the future purchases that you want to make. If you want to be thought of as a discerning Southampton graduate, you might buy a quietly understated BMW. If you want to be seen as streetwise, there is a certain tattoo you will get. If you want to be as subversive, there are certain cutouts and slashes that you need to look for in your jeans. It makes branding a highly ironic term. This came home to me in a conversation recently. Branding used to refer to the way in which slaves were marked by their owners. Now one of the unique expressions of human identity is to brand yourself with a piece of clothing or technology. And by the way, even if you're thinking, well, I choose to buy unbranded clothing because that's who I am, shows how deep it goes, doesn't it? All illustrates the broad principle. We think that in choosing, we are showing who we are. In fact, all too often, we're showing who owns us. We think we're the ones with choice, but we show that our sense of personal identity is very often influenced by the opinions of others upon us, including through media-constructed realities. Much, much, much more than we like to think. And here's the thing, you're still no closer to finding out who you really are. And so at some point, if you're to live authentically in a fast-changing world, you need to figure out who you are. Otherwise, whether you realize it or not, other people's agendas will actually be continuing to shape your destiny. and they may just be pulling you away from who you really are. Now, back in the Bourne Identity, the amnesiac doesn't want to know who he could be. In fact, he's not happy to adopt one of the range of personas that are in the box. He wants to know who he really is. He wants to know the truth. In fact, that's the plotline that drives the multiple Bourne movies. He believes there is truth to be found, and he will not rest content until he finds it. How about you? We're going to break into discussion groups around tables a few times this evening. Here's the first one to discuss, regardless of whether or not you've seen the film. It doesn't really matter. But why do you think the Bourne Identity, given what I've told you about it tonight, why do you think the Bourne Identity, a movie about somebody trying to find their true identity, has been so successful? Why don't you talk about that around tables for 4 or 5 minutes? Okay, let's draw back together again. It's going to be plenty more time to keep chatting as the evening goes on. I think one of the difficult things about talking about personal identity, and I know this will seem patronising to Southampton students, is it's just very personal, isn't it? Do you find that that's one of the reasons it's quite difficult to talk about issues of identity? There is no one else to hide behind. It can feel incredibly exposing when the light is shined upon you and you feel that there's nowhere to run. This is why I think many of the personal identities we operate by are necessarily selective. There are certain bits of me which I'm happy for the world to see, and other bits that I am definitely not happy for the world to see. Do you know that feeling? I hope that as you've gone through life, you've been able to locate some very genuine and real strengths and abilities that you have. And to be able to do so is actually part of a very healthy sense of self-identity. I know that if you're British, it can be quite hard to talk about strengths in public, but I hope that you're able to see them in you nonetheless. For my part, I want to say I think there are certain things that I do well, and it's okay to say that. And actually that often I feel like a bit of myself is coming alive when I'm able to express that part of me. But an accurate self-identity also requires that we admit that there are other things that we find hard and other areas still in which we are failing. But here's the thing. Because within our culture we don't have a reliable enough anchor point for our headlines to root a deep sense of identity, many of us find it almost impossible to talk honestly about those less positive aspects of our identity, particularly those of which we feel ashamed. It's a bit like we spend our lives in the private session mode on Spotify. Okay, now, this is me bearing my soul. This is very hard. Okay, sometimes I worry that my music tastes are not to the taste of other people whose opinion I like. And therefore, if I'm going to listen to an album and I think they will laugh at me or they will judge me, it is easier to go into the private mode and keep it hidden. That's how we often live a lot of our lives, isn't it? But you are always left wondering, is the opinion of other people upon me actually very accurate? Are they relating to the real me or the curated me that I just happen to show to the world? It's very difficult to be honest, not only with other people, but even with yourself, when your sense of personal identity feels as though it's completely tied up in value judgments. And it means this: if you're to be really honest with yourself and your others about yourself, including those bits that you think are a bit iffy or of which you're ashamed, then you must have your deep insecurities addressed. Let me say, this is one of the ways that Jesus dramatically changes the way that you think about personal identity. Now, this week we're using one of the earliest known accounts, the earliest known account of Jesus' life, the Gospel of Mark, to tackle some of these big questions. I'd love you to pick one of these up or manipulate yourself so that you can see one and turn to page 8. I'm going to read from the bottom of the page. Whilst you're turning there, let me set the context. Jesus is in the border town of Capernaum. Capernaum is a border town. That's because when the Romans invaded Judea, they pretty arbitrarily cut it up into 4 areas. And then they insisted that taxes had to be paid every time people carried something across one of these imaginary lines. Tax collectors were employed to collect these taxes in border towns like Capernaum. And on one occasion here, we read Jesus meeting one of these tax collectors. Verse 14, a man called Levi, son of Alphaeus. Levi is a tax collector. Now, it is hard for me to even begin to encapsulate how hated tax collectors were. They were hated, first off, for being in league with the Romans. After all, they made their livelihood collecting these horrible taxes for the Roman oppressors. Furthermore, tax collectors were hated because collecting these taxes made them very rich. The Romans actually allowed tax collectors to collect a little bit more than what was technically allowed and for them to pocket it, to pocket the surplus. And they did so gleefully and heartlessly. Do you know, one document from the time says that tax collectors should be viewed as worse than those with extreme infectious diseases. Another document from the day says that even if a tax collector walks past the front of your house, you should deep clean it so that the influence of the tax collector isn't felt there. And so most people would have viewed Levi as a man totally without conscience, beyond the pale, hopeless, irredeemable. And because Levi was used to hearing that sort of thing about himself, he probably started thinking it about himself too. Have you had that experience? You hear something enough about yourself that you begin to believe it. The truth is that most people would have looked at Levi and said, Levi, mate, I've got 2 words for you. And so did Jesus. But Jesus' words were very different. Have a look at verse 14. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. Now, just let that sink in. Levi is a bully. He's a traitor. He's a collaborator. And Jesus is oblivious to none of this. How do we know this? Because he meets Levi at his very booth. He knows exactly what Levi is like. And yet, Jesus chooses to go out of his way to say to Levi, follow me. Now, Mark leaves the backstory of Levi tantalizingly silent, but I don't think we're supposed to think that this is the first time that Levi had encountered Jesus. Maybe he'd listened in on Jesus' teaching. Regardless, to this point, Levi certainly believed that when it came to Jesus, he was counted out. Jesus does not want people with a personal identity, with a story like mine. And notice everything changes as Levi hears Jesus' words. Follow me, Levi. I want you, Levi. And here is the first contribution that Jesus makes to the question of personal identity. Jesus wants people as they are. In fact, as you read on in Mark's gospel, you can establish this principle even further. Jesus loves people as they are. In fact, let's make it a bit more personal. Jesus loves you as you are. Not just the person sat next to you, you. Now, here's the point. Deep and honest discovery can be made about your personal identity. You'll go to certain places you'll otherwise run a mile from when you know that you are loved and you are wanted. See, all the time you're not sure whether or not you're loved and wanted, you'll always hedge your bets. You'll always keep bits of yourself hidden, even from yourself. It's weird, isn't it? We do the kind of Spotify private session, even in our own lives. But knowing we're wanted and loved finally allows us to be honest about our successes without thinking that our value is contingent upon our performance. But also knowing that you're loved and wanted allows you to face the facts where you feel shame, where there's a question mark fluttering above, where actually you know that you are wrong. So when you know that you are loved and you are wanted, you can start to be honest, to let your wings unfurl. My guess is that most of us think that at best we'll be welcomed when people are willing to look beyond or past our faults. And that's part of the reason it's very hard talking about the things that really make us shameful. In fact, those things are almost unspeakable. But notice that is not Jesus' model of acceptance. He meets Levi, he meets us as we are in our beauty and our brokenness, in our heroism and our mess. And whatever we find, he wants us. In fact, we might say that the love of Jesus for us, the love of the one true God for us, is contra-conditional. Let me explain what I mean by that. Conditional love says, I will accept you if you do this. I will accept you, I will love you if you're lovable and acceptable. Unconditional acceptance says, I will love you and accept you regardless of what you're like. It's a bit like a love of the dog for its owner. Contra-conditional love says, I know exactly what you're like, including the horrible bits, and I don't find all of it attractive, but I love you. I want you. Let me say, of all of these, contra-conditional love, contra-conditional acceptance is by far the most powerful, because finally you can be yourself. You can be honest, including about your shame, your failure, your mess. You don't even have to pretend it's not that bad. But you can rest in love. And that is the love and acceptance that Jesus offers, which ultimately led him to die on a cross for you. Now, let me make this personal. You may have grown up, you may have arrived here believing that Jesus isn't for people who are like you. You've always thought that there's an aspect of your personal identity that counts you out from thinking that Jesus would really want you. The truth is, and I want you to hear this, Jesus' contra-conditional love is totally indiscriminate. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever you've done, whatever you see inside, he loves you and he is for you. And Levi perceives this kind of love, this kind of contra-conditional acceptance and love, and he thinks it's worth losing everything for. I mean, part of me thinks that Levi had always wanted a love like this. And now he just wants to be with Jesus. So he gets up and leaves his old life behind. Safe in the love of Jesus, he's able to ask deep questions and make deep observations about his personal identity, knowing that whatever he finds there, whatever he discovers, whatever he admits, his dignity and his value are secure. And let me say, with that, Levi's journey of welcome and transformation is about to begin. And we'll pick up that story in a few minutes. Before we get there, I'd love you to discuss this quote. In order to reckon with your true personal identity, you need to be assured you are loved as you are. Do you agree? Chat around the table about that for 4 or 5 minutes. Maybe I should add why or why not. Okay, let's draw back together. You'll have plenty more time to talk out loud, to share aspects of your story. But I want to take us a little bit further, in this question of identity, because Levi's story doesn't end with acceptance. For sure to know acceptance and love in this way is freeing. But actually, in order to know who we really are, we need more than just acceptance and love. We actually then need to be given a positive sense of who we really are. And actually, that's what Jesus gives Levi as he says, "Follow me." So the truth is, we can all place headlines over our lives and the lives of others, but some of them are only half true, or even sometimes downright inaccurate. And safe in the love of Jesus, we're freed not just to be honest with ourselves about what we're really like, we're also freed to let Jesus make sense of those various aspects of our identity. We see this in what happens next in Levi's story. The top of page 10, Levi holds an impromptu party for Jesus and invites all of his tax collector friends. It's quite a picture, isn't it? And Jesus is only too keen to attend, but it scandalizes those who are watching on. As in many of the cultures of the world that we've come from, eating with someone in Jesus' day indicated acceptance and friendship. So people are saying, what is Jesus doing eating with these scumbags? Have a look at verse 16. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with sinners and tax collectors? It is not an honest question. And that's because the religious leaders couldn't see beyond the labels that they'd already placed on Levi and his acquaintances, sinners, tax collectors. You can almost hear, can't you, the venom with which they spit out these words, as if they're nothing like us. How different Jesus is. See, he knows that these words aren't the primary headline or even the final word on these people's lives, which is why he's only too happy to eat with them. So there are certain labels that Jesus just rips up. But there are other aspects of our identity where Jesus will show us that we've always drawn the wrong conclusion about an aspect of our identity. This is a good friend of mine called Paul. We met when he was a student from Thailand and he came to study in the UK. He was very proud of his culture. He was an amazing Thai cook. And it seemed that nothing was more pleasurable than cooking Thai food for me. And I found nothing more pleasurable than eating his food. But I remember him saying, I am from Thailand. I can't be a Christian. In Thailand, we are Buddhist. Now, you may not be from Thailand, but there will be aspects of your identity which are real, but which you need Jesus to help you make sense of. You may have come to conclusions like Paul about one part of your identity, and you think, this is the script that is marked out for me. See, part of what it means to follow Jesus is to trust him to make sense of these parts of our identity. Only he can make sense of them. But Jesus still has a further word addressing why he's keen to be around Levi and his friends. Have a look at verse 17. It says, on hearing this, Jesus said to them, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, there is an awful lot going on in these sentences. At the basic level, notice Jesus says he's come as a doctor. Now, what does a doctor do? A doctor comes to treat people, to change their lives for the better. And so what's most evident here is that whilst Jesus loves and accepts Levi and his friends as they are, contra-conditionally, he's not come to leave them as they are either. He's the doctor. Levi, I think, sensed that himself. That's why I think he gets up, leaves his tax booth, and follows Jesus, never to be a tax collector again. Knowing the contra-conditional love of Jesus for him, he now has a new script, a new identity, a new way of making sense of his life. Even at this point, Levi senses that as a follower of Jesus, he cannot operate according to the same script. He cannot operate according to the same principles. He wants to live out his God-given purpose. And so here's the thing. None of the aspects of your life and your identity can earn love from Jesus. But also, none of them are immune from being touched by the love of Jesus either. You'll start to think and feel differently about every single one of them. After all, now every detail of my life matters to Jesus. There were certain things that were at the center of the spokes of my identity before which I now discover, following Jesus, that they need to be recentered. But in a sense, even as Jesus moves around and helps me to reinterpret the labels of my identity, I'm being freed to be more authentically myself. Don't need to hide bits of me anymore, even if I do need Jesus to teach me how to steward them rightly, or to bring me forgiveness, or to teach me a way of using them so that I don't hurt myself or others anymore. Now, working this out takes time. Come back to Paul from Thailand. He did eventually choose to follow Jesus, and it took him time. And I imagine it's still a work in progress for him to work out what it looks like to be a Thai follower of Jesus. He did this in conversations with other Christians from Thailand, but also from elsewhere as well. He discovered that he was able to retain the vast amount of Thai culture as a Christian. He still loves cooking Thai food, which is good news. There were a few aspects that he decided he needed to leave behind, which were incongruent with his new identity. And yet as he shed them, he believed that he was being led more authentically into the person that he was made to be, in relationship with the God who made him and loves him. The same is true from you, whether you're from Britain, whichever country of the world you're from. So let's ask this. What about each of us? What about each of us? I want to say to you that whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever you're like, there are things that you uniquely can bring to Jesus' people. You have your own unique map of experiences and relationships and gifts and talents, and you can bring them to Jesus' people. Levi, for example, almost certainly had his name changed to Matthew and then wrote one of the 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible today. I find it amazing that the very skills that Levi probably learnt in the tax booth are now re-employed by Jesus for the good of his people. Yet, as we've said on several occasions in the evenings, it's never easy being a follower of Jesus, especially in today's culture. People will make you feel like a fool for letting Jesus interpret your culture, rather than looking deep inside yourself and figuring it out for yourself. So what can make us think? What can make us think that trusting Jesus for our identity is the best thing of all? Here's the answer. Christians look to Jesus' death on the cross as a fact that he is absolutely for us, and therefore that we can trust him with our everything. Listen, when it came to Levi, Jesus didn't say that abusing other people as a tax collector didn't really matter. He didn't say this was just a neutral part of Levi's personal identity, of his story. He doesn't even resolve to look beyond Levi's guilt, perceiving some deep spark inside of him. Instead, Jesus ends the exclusion of people like Levi through taking upon his own shoulders their shame and guilt and forgiving them. Jesus doesn't call evil good or even indifferent, not Levi's evil, not the evil in your heart either. But instead he takes it upon himself through destroying it and then offering people like Levi a fresh start. Listen, according to Jesus, each of us, and I don't find it easy saying this, according to Jesus, each of us is as sick as those other people that were at Levi's party. We may not be aware of having caused obvious distress to other people on this scale, but deep evils within us have nonetheless violated how we should have treated ourselves and others, and we have spurned the living God. And yet, precisely because of his contra-conditional love and the grace he extends to forgive us at the cost of his own life through his death on the cross. Tonight, you can be loved and forgiven. Jesus absorbs the cost of your failure, my failure, so that if we come to him, we might be included and forgiven, loved as we are, and transformed as we follow him. Let me tell you what this has looked like in my own life as I've sought to make sense of my identity. 3 things. Loved by Jesus, I've begun to accept parts of myself that I previously didn't like. I'm sure we've all got bits of us that we don't really like about ourselves. I don't especially like my body shape. I wish my sense of humor was a bit quicker. My lack of coordination and sporting ability always caused me to think quite low about myself. Come to realize that I'm accepted and I'm loved as I am. In fact, I've been sculpted by God. And actually, many of these things say more about cultural preferences than they do about objective reality. So I've learned to accept parts of myself. Secondly, forgiven by Jesus, knowing my forgiveness, I'm made more aware of, but also freed from being defined by my worst. For many years, I used to lie and lie and lie, constantly told lies. I constantly wanted the approval of other people. As I began to follow Jesus, I was more aware of the pain that was causing other people. I began to feel really distressed about it to a new level. I even found it quite difficult to move on from some of the lies that I told in the past that I knew had been particularly destructive and hurt other people, had borne negative consequences. But as I placed myself in Jesus' story, I came to see that Jesus willingly paid my debt. It doesn't need to be paid again, and therefore Jesus doesn't define me by my worst, and I don't need to define myself by my worst either. One of my favorite Bible verses says, as far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. Finally, loved by Jesus, I can humbly use what I've got in the name of serving other people and honoring him. As we said earlier, we've all got unique passions, talents, gifts, skills, experiences, relationships, all which map out slightly differently. Jesus calls us to use what we have to honor him and for the good of other people. In fact, that's why I'm in Southampton this week. It doesn't depend upon my performance. It doesn't depend on how I do. I'm loved as I am, but I can use what I have to reflect the nature of Jesus along with his people to the world. It's an amazing calling. It means that actually working out our identity will be quite slightly different for each of us. Each of us will go into different families, different workplaces, different nations, different contexts. And we can step into Jesus' story and use what we have to honor him there. That's what it means for me. I wonder if you can imagine for yourself what it would mean for you. Here are a couple of questions for you to think about. Perhaps as you also think about what it would look like to have your own personal identity shaped by Jesus. And it's this. What questions about Jesus or about your own personal identity do you still have? Be brave if you can be around your tables. And then how would you like to keep asking these questions going forward? Split into these discussion groups for one last time. Okay, let's draw back. This isn't the final time that you'll be able to... This isn't the final time you'll be able to talk to each other. But our time is coming towards the formal end. And so I want us to, before we do that, just to think by how we might respond to what we've heard this evening. I'd love this not to be the climax of your thinking about your personal identity or even the high point of your contact with Jesus. So let me just question, how are you going to respond to what you've heard this evening? Listen, you may be pretty skeptical about what you've heard tonight. I just want to thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Thank you for bearing with us. I want to say that this week is all about being able to tell your story, to share your experiences, perhaps even to get some of your objections out on the table. If you feel able to keep coming, do keep coming. There are some optional questions at the end. And here's one that you might want to think about. If not through looking to Jesus, how do you know what really makes you you? Where is the better place that you will look other than Jesus to know what makes you you? You might like to pick up one of the free books over there on the way out. This book, Real Life Jesus, is one of my favorite books about Jesus and tackles this question about personal identity. Perhaps you have heard what's been said tonight. And actually, you're thinking, I hope this is true. I hope this is true. To be honest, I hope that there is a God who loves me as I am. I hope that there is a way beyond my guilt and my shame. I hope that there is a way of thinking about my identity which doesn't just regard clutching at cultural straws. But you've got lots of questions. And you realize that you need to look into this some more. Well, in a moment, we'll point to these little cards. And when we all fill them out together in a minute, I'm going to suggest that everybody writes 3 words, at least 3 words, not limited to writing 3 words, but each of us write at least 3 words. If you're skeptical, you might just want to write, I was here. If actually you'd like to find out more, you might put, I want more, or tell me more, or something like that. And a friend, somebody from the Christian Union, will draw alongside you and help you in a way that is suitable for you to ask your questions and hopefully to come to some solutions. But I suspect, I don't know this, I can't see into people's hearts, but I suspect there will be at least a few here and you are thinking, I don't know everything, but actually on the basis of what I've seen of Jesus tonight, I know enough. I know that actually if my guilt and my shame are to be dealt with, it needs to be more than just somehow airbrushing them away or forgetting them. I need to see that actually if I'm to really be my true self, I need to know that I'm loved. But actually as I see my true self, I also know that I need to be forgiven. And therefore I want in on Jesus who came and who lived and who died for me. I'm so glad that he came. You've still got questions, but to be honest, you're now at the point where it feels as though it takes more faith to walk away from Jesus than to commit yourself to him. Now what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to invite you to pray. And actually, if you would like to enter into this restored relationship, to know the living God, and actually in knowing the living God, to know yourself, then you can pray along with me. It's just committing yourself in a relationship. That's all praying is. It's talking to God. It's saying, God, I'm ready to get to know you. And in getting to know you, I'm getting ready to know myself as well. This won't be right for everybody here. And so you might just want to listen to the prayer, or you can think about something else. That's completely your choice, okay? What I'm going to suggest is that we all close our eyes now to respect those, to honor those who want to take this step. And if you want to pray along with this prayer, you don't need to say anything out loud. You can just echo it in the quiet of your heart. In this prayer, we're going to say, sorry, thank you, and please. Let's all shut our eyes now. Living God, I'm sorry. Sorry that I've lived without you in the world. I recognize that I've sought to establish my identity in the wrong places. And in seeking to make a name for myself, I've hurt others and ignored you. Thank you. Thank you that knowing every detail of my life, you love me and you were willing to send Jesus for me. Thank you that he paid for my everlasting welcome. Please forgive me. Send me your Holy Spirit that I might know the reality of your love for me just as I am, and that I might live for you. Amen. Now listen, there's nothing magical about those words, but if actually they came out of our heart saying to Jesus, I want in, you need to go, though, that the living God will accept you just as you are on the basis of what Jesus has done. But you will need some help. And so as we fill out these forms now, I would love you to write maybe as your 3 words, prayed with Pete, or something like that. Prayed along tonight. They might be your 3 words. Okay? And somebody will get alongside you, a friend will get alongside you, and will help you to keep asking your questions, keep understanding your story, and help you to understand more of what it means to follow Jesus day by day. So, if that's you, why not nail this to the mast of your heart now? Write on the form, prayed with Pete, whatever you want. You might even want to tell someone tonight, okay? And we'll draw alongside you. So what we're now going to do is we're all going to pick up the cards. Maybe, I hope all of you have got 3 words. Either, you might want to write, I was here. Might want to write more than I was here. 3-word minimum. I was here. Tell me more, I want more. Prayed with Peter, something like that. Or you might want to say, Spanish chicken, great. Lovely yellow jumper. Be back tomorrow. I don't know, I'm really struggling with 3 words. You're not limited to 3 words, but 3 words, whether or not you're in the Christian Union, whether or not you've been to one of these things before, all of us now, pick up your card, write on it, and in a couple of minutes' time, the stewards will be around to pick them all up. I'm going to write mine now. Southampton is... I'll write my comment, you write yours. Seeing you all again tomorrow if you can make it. Just 2 minutes to fill these in, and then we'll be up for the formal end of the evening.
Okay, as you're filling those out, I think someone's coming around to collect all your cards, so maybe pass them all to one person on your table so that they can be put in the box. This is the formal end to this evening. So it was really great to see you. Tomorrow we'll be back again. So tomorrow lunchtime, we've got a talk on racism, sexism, and imperialism. Are Christians on the wrong side of history? And that's at lunchtime with more food for you to have. And in the evening, pursuing my purpose. Why does it matter how I live? And that's in the evening with another wonderful meal.
It's been great to see all of you. It doesn't end at the end of this week. For the next following 5 Thursdays, we have something called Purpose Explored. So you can come along, be similar to this, have some food, ask some more questions. You'd be really welcome to come along to that as well.
And also we've got these on the table, Uncover Mark. Feel free to take them, ask a friend to read it with you or read it by yourself. It's just a great way to read one of the books of the Bible and get to know this Jesus a bit more. And we just love you to continue chatting at your tables. And then when you finish chatting...
when you finish chatting, there's going to be cake at the back. And also, if you want seconds, that's over there, so you can grab another bowl, help yourself, continue chatting. If you want to grab Pete or Sebi or the Christian who maybe brought you along or someone on your table, please do that. I'm sure they'd love to answer your questions.
Yeah, if you want seconds, follow me.